All right, back again. I made a mistake last time. It's not the golden lie, it's the noble lie. Let me get the pen marker and write it down. Noble. Hold on, I lost my marker. Now I found it again. The noble doggone lie. Noble. All right. Now the noble lie is the way that you're going to come up with a state religion. This is the religion that's going to coerce all the people through faith. Later on you'll find that people like Emil Durkheim and other people are thinking about how in order for you to have a coherent culture you need to have some sort of shared set of religious principles. Plato already began with that. And so the noble lie is how we lie to all of the members of the state to keep them in line. Part of this noble lie is that when the state works well, when the gold people act the way gold people should act, in other words, the rulers who have been the most well-educated are making the decisions about policy, at that point you have a well-organized state. When the military leaders make no decisions other than military decisions, then you have a very strong army. And when the working class works as hard as it can possibly work, then you have a very strong economy. And so what Plato is saying is something which is now an essential notion to all contemporary economists to this very day. It's the idea of comparative advantage. When anybody in a state does anything other than what they do best, that state loses economic possibilities. So Plato's already started with the idea of comparative advantage, something which will become an essential component in any class you ever take in economics. So for Plato, the perfect state is where everybody does exactly what they do best and nothing else. And if perchance it's determined that you're able to do something very well that you may not like, you still have to do it for the well-being of the state. And if anybody deviates from their job, for example, as I said last time, if the soldier pretends to rule, at this point that soldier will be thrown out of the state. And more so, more dangerous yet, is if that soldier desires any of the things that the working class has, the gold and so forth, that soldier actually will be banished, and if he comes back is killed. So these rigid classes are essential, says Plato, for the well-being of the state. And that's why, in your last discussion, we were saying whether or not you think that would be a well-ordered state. And of course it might be a well-ordered state, but is that a state that you'd want to live in? Because if you'll notice, there's no mentions whatsoever in Plato of the idea of free will. He doesn't believe in freedom. Freedom is simply fulfilling what it is that you're made to fulfill. In other words, the free person is the virtuous person. And if you don't do what you're supposed to do, not only are you not free, you're not virtuous. A hammer that hammers nails straight and is heavy enough to put that nail on the board is a good hammer. A hammer you use as a paperweight is a bad hammer. So hammer those nails well. Okay, so when that state is running perfectly, he calls that, as I said last time, an aristocracy. In an aristocracy, the rulers rule, the soldiers soldier, and the workers work. However, hold on, let me erase this again. I can't spell. Now you see what real class is like with me. All right, aristocracy. Aristocracy. In an aristocracy, the rulers rule, the soldiers soldier, and the workers work. This is a perfect state. However, inevitably you'll have a weak ruler. When you have a weak ruler, then the soldier classes will become dominant. And you can see this taking place right now in the world scene at this very moment. What happens in Egypt? So the rulers became weak and the soldiers take over. So in Egypt it was particularly clear because what happened was that it was the soldier class, the military generals, that began to take control. So aristocracy, as it devolves, goes from aristocracy to what Plato calls timocracy. Timocracy, the word timo comes from time or honor. So timocracy is rule for honor. The first is the rule by reason. Second is rule for the sake of honor. Now, rule by honor is not a bad state. So in a timocracy, you now have sort of the samurai warrior class. These are the warriors who are rulers, who keep trading things organized, very strong armies. But inevitably, those warriors will begin to look beneath them and discover, holy cow, I have no silver, no gold, no pleasures of life. I'm just soldiers who spend their whole time in the barracks fighting and preparing to be good soldiers. And he's actually thinking about Sparta when he comes up with this. And these soldiers begin to notice that all the pleasures of life are in the working classes. So they take their weapons and they steal those things. And this is a further devolution of the state. You go from timocracy now what he calls plutocracy. And plutocracy comes from Pluto. And Pluto is the god of the underworld, or the god of gold. And so what happens is now you have a military state, still very well educated and reasonable, not as good as the aristocracy, but still very well educated and reasonable. But this plutocratic state is one that's also driven by passion. So now you have a mixture of honor and passion. And that's the beginning of the real downfall. Now the passionate horse has come into leading the chariot, and you know no good can come of that. At some point, the working classes who used to have all the joys, all the pleasure, all the bodily luxuries, begin to look and they say, these darn soldiers have taken our stuff, and I'd like to get that stuff back. And there's not really that many soldiers, but there's a whole lot of us. And at this point, the working class then organizes, and they overthrow the plutocracy, and they have now the worst form of government imaginable, as what Plato calls it, almost no government at all, and that's called democracy. That's right. Democracy is a terrible form of government, because in democracy the stupidest people are now ruling. So those least competent to make the most important decisions are those making important decisions. And the reason that Plato's so upset with democracy is he can see that it's exactly what led to Socrates' death. If you can manipulate the masses through simply rhetoric, and this is the whole idea that rhetoric goes well with democracy, philosophy goes well with aristocracy, but the rhetorician is one that doesn't care about the truth. The rhetorician is merely somebody who knows how to convince and persuade the audience to believe anything because it sounds good. So Gorgias and Protagoras and these sophists are the people who Plato is opposed to. These are the sophists and the relativists who believe that the sound of the speech is more important than the content of the speech, and therefore you can manipulate the masses to do any variety of crazy things. However, in a democratic society, he says this is like having all the people in a ship, and they have no idea how to read the stars or where they're going, and one day they decide they want to eat all the food in the holds, and they take the captain, and they throw his ass overboard, and they eat all the food in the holds of the ship. At this point, they're stuck adrift at sea. They have no food. They have no idea of where they're going. That's a pretty horrible situation. Under those circumstances, democracy has now set the stage for the last possible degradation. At this point, one person comes to that disconnected mass of people where everyone is confused and people don't do very well. The enemy is coming on from the borders because you can't control yourself anymore. And somebody says, vote me in. I will lead you to perfect and beautiful days. At that point, you go from democracy to despotism. And now it's ruled by despot. And that's the worst possible situation. Democracy is ruled merely by passion, by appetite alone. But despot is ruled by the infinite appetite of only one person. So democracy would be appetite of the many. Despot is appetite of one single person. Now, here's the question that Plato asks. If you were a despot, would you be happy? And of course, people think, sure, I'd be happy. I could do whatever the hell I want. But if you think about it a little more clearly, you realize that's not true at all. If you're the despot, you're like a cocaine addict in front of a mountain of cocaine. You want to call that happiness or a very short life expectancy? Now, that's exactly how it goes for the despot. So the despot is what Plato will describe in the Republic as the democratic man writ large. Now, this is an interesting idea. For Plato, he says the state, the Republic, is but man writ large. That's his actual expression. The Republic is man writ large. So the perfect man, a perfect human being, the perfect woman, is a person who has reason controlling heart, controlling body, and the perfect state is a state that has reason controlling heart, controlling body. But if that man is out of order, his love is disordered, he will be a miserable and unhappy human being. If that state is out of order, if instead of being organized by the philosopher ruler is ordered instead by appetite, that will be a miserable state. And the more extreme that appetitive urge is, the more miserable that state will be. And if you want to see how that looks, just simply look at Darfur. They have no government whatsoever. It's merely ruled by various despots maintaining control for short periods of time. So this is the worst thing to happen for Plato. His fear so much of a rule by the rabble, democracy, ultimately means that he creates a government which seems to me much more like a kind of it's not an aristocracy, it's more of a kind of tyrannical government ruled by a very rigid structure. This is autocracy as we now think of it. But in Plato's day, a strong rule from the top, leading through the soldiers down to the workers, for him, he thought this would make a government where everyone within that government would also be happy. So that's it. We will move to the next stop in just a second.